Picture this. Two mighty Italian city-states mobilize their entire armies, spend vast fortunes on mercenaries, and engage in brutal warfare that claims thousands of lives. The prize they're fighting over? Not territory, not trade routes, not political power. A wooden bucket. Yes, you heard that right, a bucket. And not even a particularly fancy one. Welcome to one of history's most gloriously absurd conflicts, where medieval pride, petty rivalry, and human stubbornness collided to create what might be the most ridiculous war ever fought. This isn't just some footnote in dusty history books. This is a tale so bizarre, so utterly preposterous that it reads like satire. Yet every bloody, bucket-obsessed moment of it actually happened. Today we're diving deep into the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict that proves beyond any doubt that humans will literally fight about anything if their egos are bruised badly enough. We're talking about a war where grown men in full armor charged into battle screaming about wooden containers, where diplomats negotiated terms over what was essentially medieval plumbing equipment, where entire family fortunes were spent pursuing what amounts to the world's most expensive theft. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. This wasn't just some random skirmish between a couple of angry villages. We're talking about Bologna and Modena, two of the most powerful city-states in 14th century Italy. These weren't backwater settlements. These were sophisticated political entities with professional armies, complex economies, and enough military might to reshape the region. And they went to war over a bucket. Now, before you start thinking this is just another case of medieval people being medieval people, let me blow your mind with the sheer scale of what we're dealing with. The War of the Oaken Bucket involved thousands of soldiers, consumed enormous resources, and fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Italy. We're not talking about a weekend skirmish. This was a full-blown military campaign that dragged on for years and involved some of the most powerful families and factions in Italian politics. The bucket in question wasn't even made of gold or studded with precious gems. It was just a regular old oak bucket, the kind you'd use to draw water from a well. But somehow this humble piece of wood became the catalyst for one of the most spectacularly pointless wars in human history. It's like if two modern nations went to war over a stolen shopping cart, except with way more armor and significantly less convenience. What makes this story even more delicious is that everyone involved knew exactly how ridiculous it was. Contemporary chroniclers were basically rolling their eyes while they documented the whole affair. Poets wrote satirical verses about it. Even the soldiers fighting the war probably went home to their families and had to explain with straight faces that yes, they'd spent the day risking their lives over stolen bucket storage solutions. But here's where it gets really interesting. The War of the Oaken Bucket wasn't actually about the bucket at all. Shocking, I know. The bucket was just the final straw. The perfect symbol of everything these two cities hated about each other. Bologna and Modena had been locked in a bitter rivalry for decades, fighting over trade routes, political influence, and territorial boundaries. They were looking for an excuse to settle their differences with swords, and a stolen bucket gave them exactly the justification they needed. Think of it like this. Imagine two neighbors who've been feuding for years over property lines, noise complaints, and parking spaces, Then one day, one of them steals the other's garden gnome. Suddenly, it's not about the gnome anymore. It's about respect, about dignity, about who's going to back down first. Except in medieval Italy, garden gnome disputes involved professional soldiers and siege engines. The theft itself happened in 1325, and it was almost comically straightforward. A group of Modenese soldiers launched a raid into Bolognese territory, and during their retreat they grabbed this oak bucket from a well. It wasn't even the main objective of the raid. They probably just thought, hey, free bucket. Little did they know they'd just stolen the Helen of Troy of medieval water containers. Bologna's response was swift and absolutely disproportionate. They demanded the bucket back. When Modena refused, Bologna essentially declared, fine, we'll take it back by force, along with your entire city while we're at it. And thus began one of history's most gloriously petty military campaigns. What's fascinating is how quickly this escalated beyond just Bologna and Modena. Medieval Italian politics was basically Game of Thrones with better food, and every major family, faction, and city-state had to pick sides. The Papal States got involved. The Holy Roman Empire took an interest. Before long, what started as a dispute over plumbing equipment had drawn in half of northern Italy. The armies that assembled were massive by medieval standards. We're talking about thousands of professional soldiers, cavalry units, siege equipment, and enough medieval military hardware to level entire cities. The battle preparations alone cost both cities astronomical sums. Bologna hired Florentine mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for whoever paid the most. Modena countered by recruiting Genoese crossbowmen, specialists in long-range warfare who could punch through armor at impressive distances. Both sides invested in the latest military technology, including primitive cannons and sophisticated siege towers that could breach the strongest fortifications. Picture the absurdity of the situation. Quartermaster generals were calculating supply lines for armies marching to war over a water vessel. Military engineers were designing siege strategies to reclaim what was essentially medieval kitchenware. Battlefield commanders were giving rousing speeches about honor and glory while everyone knew they were fighting for the right to own a bucket. The first major engagement happened at the Battle of Zappolino in November 1325, just months after the Great Bucket Theft. This wasn't some minor skirmish between a few dozen soldiers. We're talking about a full-scale medieval bloodbath involving over 15,000 troops on both sides. Knights in full plate armor charged across muddy fields while crossbow bolts darkened the sky above them. Infantry formations clashed with pikes and swords, fighting with the desperate intensity of men defending their homeland. Bologna brought their famous cavalry, heavily armored knights mounted on massive war horses bred specifically for combat. These weren't just soldiers, they were the medieval equivalent of tanks, capable of smashing through enemy lines with devastating force. Modena responded with disciplined infantry squares and those deadly Genoese crossbowmen whose steel bolts could drop a charging knight at 200 paces. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval tactical brutality. Bologna's cavalry charged repeatedly into Modena's defensive positions, only to be met by walls of pikes and volleys of crossbow fire. bodies piled up in the autumn mud as both sides fought with suicidal determination. The sounds of clashing metal, screaming horses, and dying men echoed across the countryside for hours. When the dust settled, Modena had achieved a stunning victory. Bologna's forces were shattered, their cavalry decimated, and their military reputation in ruins. Thousands lay dead on the battlefield, their blood soaking into Italian soil over a dispute that had started with stolen plumbing equipment. It was one of the most decisive military victories of the era, and it was all about a bucket. But here's where the story gets even more ridiculous. After crushing Bologna's army and securing their military dominance, did Modena return the bucket as a gesture of goodwill? Did they use their victory to negotiate a lasting peace? Of course not. They took their stolen bucket and put it in the most prominent place possible, displaying it like a trophy in their city's bell tower. The bucket became Modena's ultimate symbol of victory. A constant reminder to everyone that they had humiliated their rivals in the most spectacular way possible. Visitors to the city were shown the famous bucket, the piece of wood that had launched 1,000 ships and cost thousands of lives. It was like medieval trolling taken to its absolute extreme. Bologna, meanwhile, was left to lick their wounds and contemplate the staggering cost of their bucket obsession. They had lost an entire army, spent their treasury, and damaged their reputation across Italy, all for a piece of oak that probably cost less than a decent pair of shoes. Military historians still debate whether it was the most expensive bucket in human history or simply the most embarrassing military defeat ever recorded. The war's aftermath reshaped northern Italian politics for decades. Modena's victory established them as a major regional power, while Bologna's defeat weakened their influence throughout the region. Trade routes shifted, alliances crumbled, and the entire balance of power in medieval Italy was altered by what amounted to a really expensive theft recovery operation gone wrong. What makes this even more perfect is that the bucket still exists today. You can actually visit Modena and see the famous Oaken Bucket that launched one of history's most ridiculous wars. It sits in the Palazzo Comunale, a tourist attraction that draws visitors from around the world who want to see the piece of wood that medieval Italians considered worth dying for. Modern historians have spent centuries trying to explain how rational people could engage in such spectacular madness over such a trivial object. And there you have it, the complete and utterly bonkers tale of the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict so magnificently absurd that it makes every other historical rivalry look positively reasonable by comparison. We've witnessed medieval Italy at its most gloriously petty, where wounded pride and stolen plumbing equipment combined to create one of history's most expensive temper tantrums. Think about it. Thousands of soldiers died, entire treasuries were emptied, political alliances crumbled, all because someone grabbed a bucket and refused to give it back. It's a testament to the spectacular depths of human stubbornness and the incredible lengths people will go to when their egos are on the line. The next time you think modern conflicts are ridiculous, just remember Bologna and Modena. Remember that somewhere in Italy there's still a bucket sitting in a museum that cost more lives than most entire wars. Remember that humans have always been capable of turning the most trivial disputes into earth-shattering drama.